Today's episode is brought to you by FOCAL, a global leader in high-fidelity solutions. Since 1979, FOCAL has designed and developed innovations and technologies in France for speaker drivers, high-fidelity loudspeakers, home audio speakers, headphones, and more. Be part of the FOCAL experience at FOCAL.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by SCHIITdotCOM. SCHIITdotCOM designs and builds audio components in California. Based in Valencia, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit SCHIIT.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's www.SCHIIT.com. Today's episode is also brought to you by ZUAUDIO. ZUAUDIO's new Soul loudspeaker combines the build quality to rival the finest furniture, with a sound that sets a new standard for what is possible within a modern form in an accommodating size. ZU's Soul will amaze your ears, eyes, and your brain, and built to do it decade after decade without losing one bit of their magic. To learn more, go to ZUAUDIO.com/soul. That's ZUAUDIO.com/SOUL. Everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. One of my favorite interviews, Andrew Jones, has been on the show before, but it was quite a while ago. You guys check out that first one. And on that podcast, we talked a lot about Andrew Jones and his history and where he's come from and what he's done. And if you want to get a big glimpse of, who he is, check out the earlier podcast from long ago. I think it was actually season 1. But for this podcast, we want to kind of talk about the here and now. Things have changed a little bit. There's been a little bit of transformation in the world, and I'm wondering, for Andrew Jones specifically, has there been much change since we last spoke? Because we originally kind of caught you right around the time the first debut line for ELAC hit the market, and it was quite a success. What have you learned since those days? Has anything changed for you design-wise or even marketing-wise when you think about designing a speaker?
When we launched Debut, it was obviously to start the new company. And when I say new company, ELAC has been around for a long time, but not had much of a presence for speakers, at least in the US. So the idea is, okay, let's build an offshoot of the original German company here in the US, have both teams operating. Germany continues designing products in the way they have, but we'll build up a market here in the US for speakers I've designed and that get sold around the world by both parties. And then once we've established a reputation for ELAC, we can bring certain models over from Germany and start selling those. And we're at that stage now, but it's taken a while to get there. And we felt that the quick way to build up a following is not to spend years designing a flagship and then try and get that into a few stores and nobody gets to really hear it. It was to continue what I'd been doing with the low-cost Pioneer speakers. So, but not compete directly with what we had done, because those are still on the market, even now. It was, what were people asking for? They were asking for the next step up, still affordable speakers, but the next step up from those Pioneers. So that became the Debut. Roughly double the price, $229 a pair. So it was still on this sort of a change for me from the most recent past of doing high-end speakers with TAD to going back to how I first actually started at KEF. My first speaker for KEF was a range that was the most affordable in the KEF lineup. So I kind of gone back to where I started by going back to addressing affordable speakers. And it's fun because as much fun it is doing high end and getting to know some of those customers very well, and, them becoming friends, it's obviously a limited market. And it's fun if you're going to do and try and do something well, it's nice to be recognized for it. The ego part, it's cool seeing lots of people enjoying the speakers, seeing them come out of stores having just bought some speakers. That sort of happens all the time, whereas a TAD will sell, a few a year kind of scale. And it made me fascinated with what else can be done in the entry-level market. And that's what spawned the Unify. It's, well, okay, we've met the need of the people who wanted to spend, let's say, an average of $250. Now what happens when they want to spend $500? And I'd also made sure that these speakers, you've got to be aware of the system that these speakers are being used in. I had gone for low efficiency but extended bass. So, and I tend to do that over all of the speakers. Therefore, you're always going to need a reasonably capable amplifier to drive them. And I pretty much used very capable electronics to drive them when I've been doing shows, because I've shown a new way of doing a mix match. Instead of the old of 40% for your sources plus amplifier, 60% on your speaker, I've really turned it on the head, something like 80% for the source, 20% for the speaker, because that speaker was good enough to be able to work and show you just that it was worth having the more expensive system, even though you were using it in a low-cost speaker. Obviously, it gives up on looks because it's just a vinyl cabinet, but it gave the sound. And when it came to going past the debut, it's, well, let's see what everyone else is doing at the $500 price point. And I think people imagine that I'm listening to every competitor's speaker, and I honestly don't. We occasionally get some of them in to do sort of a teardown. It's to do with, well, how well is it built? Where did they spend money? How much money has been spent to achieve that? Because we at least need to be competitive in that approach and know that our vendors are giving us the prices that we want. But from listening to them, I do measure them, of course. And one of the prime things I want to do when I'm measuring them is establish some simple parameters. What's the bass extension? What's the sensitivity? And what is the impedance? Because the very first decision you make when you're designing speaker is size of box and either how loud or how low will it go. And those are intertwined in a, technically with the physics of it. So you can't have a small box and high efficiency and low bass. We wish we could, but you just can't. But when you're selling speakers, there's marketing behind it, and often how true are the specs that are quoted out in the marketplace. I would get very disheartened if I had to compete with the specs that some manufacturers claim to have. Because I look at what I'm doing, I look at the calculations, and I go, but this you can't have both of those. And as a result, I get into trouble sometimes with the product, because people will come and say, well, yours is a 4-ohm speaker and these others are 8-ohm. My amplifier says it won't drive 4-ohm. And the answer is, well, these other speakers that you're quoting are not really 8-ohms. They are 4-ohm speakers. They're just saying 8-ohm compatible. What the hell does that mean? Mm-hmm. So,
and isn't it true too that fluctuation is also variable on frequency? Like it's not across the frequency range, it's not always the same, or am I off base on that?
No, that's true. In some respects, the trick that's played is you have a speaker that's not flat, and you let it rise up towards the treble and have some peak somewhere, and you say, "Oh, that reached 94. That's what I'm going to say it's doing."
Well, because it's usually a lot of them will mention it at 1K, right? That's where they kind of pull it from.
I don't know anyone for a speaker giving that narrow, just saying 1K, because it's too iffy. There's too many wiggles. One way is to average it out over a certain frequency band. You measure at a few different frequencies and average them. Certainly, when you see specifications for drive units, they tend to do that. But I have to know what it's actually doing, because like I say, the first choice is what blend between those three choices do I go for? So having got that part of the way, we've now looked to see if I'm not going to be as efficient as this speaker or as high impedance, am I going to get a result that people can live with, but give me the advantage of perhaps I've traded efficiency for bass extension, which is my favorite thing to do. But when we looked at $500 speakers, we see that pretty much to a non-informed new listener, let's say, going into the store for the first time and trying to build an entry-level system, if he's trading from 250 to 500, they all still look the same as the $250 speaker. It's a woofer and a tweeter. The box is better, nicer finished, maybe real wood veneer, maybe, or partially painted. Nicer looking drivers, maybe better cone materials, a better dome material for the tweeter. But it's just this woofer and tweeter. So how are you persuaded to spend more money? Hopefully it sounds a lot better than the 250 speaker, but people are always a bit nervous about trusting their own judgment, when they go into a store, and fearing they'll make the wrong decision. So we thought what we should do is do something different as we go up in that price point, and that was the Unify. Make it a concentric driver and make it three-way, because I don't like doing two-way concentric drivers. There's a lot of compromises you make in a two-way concentric, and I thought, well, if I can avoid that by going to three-way, and of course for TAD I was doing three-way, for Pioneer I was doing concentric drivers and three-way systems. It's what Andrew does, three-way concentric. It's my most common kind of goal to aim for, if I can technically. So it would look immediately different if you're going into the store and go, oh, well, that one's different. Why is that one different? Let me listen to that one. So it gives you a helping hand towards acceptance to spend that extra money. And then, of course, the technology allows it to do things that a simple two-way doesn't do. So with ELAC, or my part in ELAC, it's mostly been concerned with more value for money, affordable speakers. I did do the Adante speaker, which was $2,500 for a pair of bookshelves and $5,000 for the tower. But mostly I've kept down below that price, partly because our ELAC group is already producing a lot of product in those higher price points. But it's also partly say, if we can say we can always try and give you value for money, even at a $2,500 price point, I was trying to get it to be sort of a high-end speaker, but at an affordable price, with the intent that you'd put it into a high-end system, not just put a cheap amplifier and cheap DAC on it, but really treat it as though it belongs in a high-end system.
Mm-hmm.
But doing something more affordable. And pretty much everything we've done at my part of ELAC has been that, affordable speakers, but just applying as many tricks as I can. And, from a point of view of, am I learning? Yes, I'm learning. You learn all the time. You've always got ideas that you want to test out,
Mm-hmm.
and they just manifest themselves in a different way.
Now, you said that you had an opportunity to kind of look at some of your competitors. Did you get a chance to look at the new LS50 Meta? Because they kind of introduced some like new technology with this Meta. I think it's more of like a grid with some lines, with some grooves in it to help direct sound, adjust, augment sound. What do you make of all that? And did you get a chance to look at that too?
So I've been following metamaterials for a while, but not thinking they were at a stage of being usable in speakers yet. And then Kev introduced the LS50M. It is usable. My bad. I should have paid a bit more attention. So, congratulations to Kev on that. I read their research paper that they published in the AES, and they collaborated with I think a German-based company that has expertise in metamaterials. And a quick explanation of a metamaterial. So absorbers, it takes a lot of absorbent material to fully absorb sound. Think of an anechoic chamber. You've got these 3-foot deep wedges, and they never 100% absorb. At best, 90%. They'll always reflect something. And to absorb low frequencies, they have to be big. They have to be at least a quarter wavelength deep as a rule of thumb, to have any effective absorption characteristic. Metamaterials have it started with tiny little resonators. We know if we put a little resonator in a sound field, it will absorb very efficiently over a very narrow frequency range. So a metamaterial is, one aspect of a metamaterial is you put lots of them all tuned to adjacent very narrow frequency bands. And so overall, they'll have very good absorption over a wider range of frequency. It's how you build those. And it's basically like, it's either a resonator like a Helmholtz resonator when you blow over a bottle top, or it's what we call a quarter wave stub, been used forever in radio frequencies with antennas. If you have in acoustics, if you have let's say a tube that's a quarter of a wavelength long, so it is closed at one end and it's open at the other end, and it interacts with the air at one end, forms a standing wave, and by virtue of the acoustics, it sort of is a dead short acoustically, and so it sucks energy from the sound field at that point and shorts it to ground. So the other way of doing it, you can stack lots of those, lots of different length tubes. The trick is, how do you optimally stack them and put them in and use them? And so what Kev came up with was that slim disc that looks like one of those little games that you had as a kid.
I was thinking of that too.
The maze, and you had the ball bearing flowing through the maze. That's what it looks like. But these maze channels are channels of different lengths, and then there's some acoustic resistance material at the entrance to it. And what you're essentially doing is stacking lots of these quarter wave resonators to each other in an efficient form of how you stack all these different length tubes together. And they chose to use it not to absorb sound waves inside the cabinet, although I can't imagine they're not going to be doing that next. but they decided that the back wave from the tweeter diaphragm, that's what they want to absorb. So that metamaterial in there is strictly for the speaker itself, for the tweeter itself, to absorb the back wave of the dome. And I have not evaluated one yet. I've looked at all the reviews, I've looked at all the published curves, and certainly on the whole, everybody thinks it's a great improvement. The issue I have in making those kind of decisions is it also has a very different frequency response than the original speaker. You know, it's not like they literally put that material on the back of the tweeter and that's become the M. They've changed the crossover. So how much of the sound you're hearing is due strictly to the metamaterial? I can't say. And I don't think anyone who's bought a pair to evaluate can say that. Kef can, and I have total and utter respect for the Kef engineering team. The guys that got there now, brilliant engineers. And we're all friends on Facebook, and we make fun of each other and all sorts of things. And they've done some brilliant work there. So I'm excited for them if they're already on that path and what they might do. And maybe I have to play catch up now.
So, but in really layman's kind of terms, they're just essentially fine tuning the tweeter frequency response within that one drive unit, right? So aren't there other techniques by which you can fine tune it, or is it more of like a damping, or does it affect fidelity? Are they literally just like, okay, we're going to go in there with very specific requests on the frequency range and then make sure it goes exactly the way we want it? Or is it more complicated than that?
It's more complicated, but basically what they're saying is the back wave launches from the dome. You know, whenever you're building a tweeter, if you're building a very compact tweeter, the dome is sat right on top of the pole piece. Mm-hmm. And there's very little space underneath it. And so you'll get reflections back from that pole piece, maybe passing back through the dome. Any small enclosed space will have standing wave resonances at some frequency. You put a piece of felt often underneath that dome to try and absorb some of those frequencies. Or you put as big a hole as you can manage to put through the center pole before you start saturating and losing flux and hence efficiency. So now the sound is not trapped fully underneath the dome, it can go back. What do you do with it as it comes back? You put a metal or a plastic cup on the back of the magnet with some felt in there to try and absorb that sound.
Okay.
But now you've got a bigger space where you can develop standing waves and resonances and things. So ideally, what you'd want is that sound to start going down the tube that's been bored through the middle of the pole piece, and maybe have a very, very, very long tube attached to it. So that sound just keeps going and never returns. And in fact, if you read Kef's papers, there was a speaker from the 70s at Kef that did exactly that. There was a tube on the back of the magnet, and it was filled with a graded density of foam wall as you go further along the tube to absorb the sound and never let it go back. And that's what they're saying about metamaterials. It's a much more compact way of getting absorption, and it's a way that you can exceed the amount of absorption you would be able to achieve from the other methods. It's a bit like the change from ferrite to neo. You can build drivers with ferrite magnets, but if you want more and more flux, the magnets start to get very big and heavy. Neo has got 10 times, let's say, the magnetic energy density of ferrite. So what would have been huge as a ferrite magnet becomes manageable as a neomagnet. Similar with this metamaterial approach that Kef have used.
That's pretty interesting stuff. So in terms of bringing it back a little bit to you in the ELAC company, how has things changed for you in the COVID environment that we deal in? You're obviously doing more of these remote interviews. You're still in Los Angeles, are you not? Or have you moved?
Yes.
Because some people took off. I have quite a few New York friends that came to Los Angeles. They were like, well, if we can't access the city, we might as well live somewhere a little bit less expensive. But you're still hanging out here in Los Angeles. You didn't abandon us.
All right, New York is less expensive than Los Angeles. I don't think
so. I'm not saying that, but I think that a lot of people were like, my friends moved back to LA. They were living in New York, but I think that the argument is that for a city that costs so much, if you're not accessing that city, it doesn't make as much monetary sense. But I'm referring more to you personally, or with the business, things have changed a little bit. And the reason I bring it up is because while some companies have said it's been a little bit harder on them, they've had to shift. Some of the more budget-oriented companies have said they've actually seen success, that this environment, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, is not great, but it has brought people home. It has made them look at their sources of entertainment at the home and said, you know what? I think it's time to get into hi-fi. So there's, and this is, an ELAC, in my mind at least, would be one of those brands that'd be like, okay, I want to kind of refine my sound system. Where do I go? And I'm just kind of curious how that has maybe affected you guys, or negatively or positively, or just average year.
Yeah, we were fearing what would happen when this all started, and we were frantically trying to apply for any of those loans that you could get that wouldn't have to be repaid, to buffer ourselves. But it's turned out to be a good year. Very healthy sales. And it's like you alluded to, that people are now trapped at home. And what are they going to do? Hi-fi used to be big in the 70s. Lots of big hi-fi companies, lots of sales, lots of hi-fi stores. And it's been shrinking because there's so many other things to do with your time and your money. When COVID hit, for those fortunate to still be working, I feel sorry for the people who did lose their jobs, because I didn't. Mine's been secure, it turned out, through all that time, because sales were great. We are in a field where we've got lots of affordable speakers. If you can't go out to restaurants, you can't go on vacation, you can't go to the movie theaters. So all the things you were spending leisure money on, you're going to spend around the home. If you need to do upgrades to your home, you can't find contractors that have got availability. They're all very, very busy because you've changed. What's my priority now? It's what I do at home is my priority. Time to freshen up the house. Let's get the paint cans out, that kind of thing. And hi-fi is part of that. Your home office. Well, if it's your own home office, why not put in a home office system? You couldn't listen to music all day long over speakers in your regular work office. You might do it on headphones, but then if someone wants to talk to you, you can't hear them approaching because you got your headphones on. At home, you're fine. And so people have either been upgrading their main systems, or they've been buying and setting up additional systems. And we seem perfectly poised to take advantage of that. And from a work environment, we were able to shrink who comes into the office down to just 2 people. Obviously, I can't work at home. I can do some of my computer work at home and my crossover network optimizations in the computer. I can do that there. But it always, I was going to draw this thing up. Where's a drive unit? I need to get a drive unit. I'm not I tried for a week to bring things home that I might need to work from home. And it was, so the dining room table was full of drive units and computers and cables and things. And my wife's looking at me. I'm thinking, yeah, this isn't going to last long, is it? Luckily, where we work, as I say, most people were allowed or able to work efficiently at home. And there were just two of us. We both had our own offices, and all of my lab area and measuring areas on an entirely different circulatory system for the air handling. So it was a very safe environment for me. And I wasn't using public transport to get to work, for the simple fact that LA doesn't have anything worth speaking about. So it's go from your safe home into your car, get out of the car, into the office, which is safe, go home. So I was able to continue pretty much every day to work there. And so it's been a time where I can, one thing you could say, without being able to travel anywhere, and of course I loved traveling, I loved going to all the shows, both in the USA and internationally, that all went away. But that saves you a lot of time that you can use for other things. And you mentioned about doing podcasts and all these video things. I've done quite a lot this year and got used to doing those. And that's taken the place of what I would be talking about at a show. I think that those people who know the brand, if I launched something new within the year of COVID, they feel confident to purchase it based on they have heard it at shows, or a lot of people have said that they recommend it, so that the risk is relatively low if they purchase it unheard. But also they may have already been exposed to it at different shows and go, yeah, now's the time to buy it. So if you're an established brand, if you step up with your internet marketing process, you overcome some of the loss of stores and certainly the loss of shows for a while. If you were new just before COVID hit and you were reliant on going into all the shows to give exposure to the market you're selling into, then COVID would have been a very tough year. But for us, no, it's worked out well. And it seems horrible to be saying that, with what's happened to everybody during COVID. But I've been lucky. I'm okay. Lots of other people in the hi-fi industry are okay. And I feel very saddened by those who didn't make it through this year.
So, yeah, it has been tough for a lot of people.
Yeah.
A lot of people. But I do think that in a way, at least one of the positive things we can look at is that this is opening a lot of doors, and it is providing, I would say, a much needed emotional release for a lot of people getting into hi-fi, doing something that it personally extends your like just your enjoyment of life. I mean, if you like music and you're hearing music better for the first time ever, I think any form of entertainment that allows you to function in a smaller space than you're used to, especially in lieu of no concerts. This is something I think that we can all at least celebrate the fact that we're providing some form of entertainment in any of its shapes in these trying times. I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit into two. We've already touched on both of these a little bit, but I want to go into a little bit specific. So if you guys are interested in a more technical kind of thing than we've even talked about here, we're going to go through two quick points here, and I'll highlight them first, and Andrew will talk about them, and then we'll go into more generic things. But specifically, and from a technical perspective, a couple of brief things we've talked about. You and I actually had some interaction earlier last year, I think it was, about something you spoke even in this podcast about, and that is getting deep bass from small cabinets. You've alluded that a low-reaching bass from a bookshelf or a small cabinet form factor, it demands a less efficient power usage than bigger full-size speakers. Can you explain why you decide to go that route and why it's physically, and I don't want you to reveal your secret sauce, but why is it technically impossible to get low-reaching bass in small cabinets, like physically speaking, or from an electronic standpoint, design-wise?
So first, why am I doing it?
Yeah.
I've often said if you have this choice between efficiency and bass extension, and because you've got a given size cabinet that we've determined, we want the bookshelf to be about this big. Now, which do I give it? Bass extension or efficiency? So let's examine, what does efficiency do for you? It enables you to play louder for a given input power. And we talk about power, but we really mean volts, because the speaker impedance is such a complex shape of impedance that very difficult to calculate the actual power that's going in, but you can measure absolutely very easily the voltage that's going in. So when we talk about speaker sensitivity, the definition of sensitivity is how many dB SPL for a certain voltage input. And then we'd look to say, well, what voltage can, let's say, a 100 watt amplifier put out? Well, it's 28 volts RMS. So we're back to voltage, and we say, oh, that will now give us so much dB out of the speaker. A low sensitivity speaker needs more input voltage to get to a certain listening level. How often do you utilize the full output capability of that amplifier? And the answer is not very often. Music is very dynamic. It's got loud peaks, but the average level is maybe 10 times below the peak level, long-term average power. So even if you're running that amplifier just into clipping at 100 watts, you might have 10 watts of average power. And only some of that goes into the bass unit, only some of it goes into the tweeter or mid-range if you've got a three-way system. Now, the act of designing to give you a high efficiency speaker, as I say, you have to have very lightweight cones, strong magnets, all this kind of stuff to get that sensitivity level. But you've given up the bass, and it can dramatically give up the amount of bass. For what? For those few occasions when you're going to play very loud. You just know most of the time you're not. So are you willing to make that sacrifice? Because all music contains bass, and current popular music has a lot of bass, more than ever before, and very low bass, so at high levels. If you give that up, you've lost a lot of the drive behind the music and the feel of it. It's supposed to shake you. It's supposed to be visceral as you can do it. And in cars, you can create that much more easily in a home, because the car is a very small acoustic space. It's variable from car to car, like a listening room is. But certainly as a manufacturer, once you've designed a system to go into that car, you know that every customer is hearing the sound in the same way, the way that you designed it to sound. Whereas in the home, I design a pair of speakers. I don't know what it's going to sound like in your home. I have to make educated guesses. So I don't want to give up the bass, because I've given up something that is in that music independent of listening level. Obviously if you turn down the level, some of the very low frequencies will disappear because they drop below audibility. But for the most part, you hear that bass at all your replay levels, and pretty much all the time. So that's why I do it. And yes, you could use a subwoofer. And in the context of a home theatre system, every receiver is equipped to feed a dedicated signal to the subwoofer, have the crossover filters to be able to match them to the subwoofer. Stereo systems don't. It's a mess. Trying to add a subwoofer to a stereo system is very difficult and doesn't allow you to play any louder typically, because the main amplifier does not have a high pass filter, a filter that cuts off the low bass. So you're putting just as much bass into the speaker as you were before, and causing the woofer cone to move just as much as it did, even though it couldn't really produce much sound, especially if it's below the tuning frequency of a vented box. The cone is just wanging back and forth, and yet producing no real sound. It's a British term, but a British technical term.
I'm sure.
But the bass is still being fed to the subwoofer. So now you can't play any louder overall than you could before you added the subwoofer. The low notes are louder, but the mid and treble can't go any louder because they're tied in to that signal that's being wasted in your main speaker. Then you've got all the problems of how do you match them together to sound right. I'm the speaker designer. I'm the guy who's supposed to do that. Make sure your bass driver crosses over properly to your mid-range, which crosses over properly to your tweeter. And yet, in a subwoofer type application, we go, you have a go. It's see how easy this is. And so, particularly with starter systems, people are unlikely to have the knowledge of what you would do with a subwoofer properly, certainly not the knowledge of how to properly integrate it. And so why not try and make sure the speaker gives more bass, more extended bass, so at least you have a chance of capturing back some of that feeling of the bass that you demand to have from your system.
So one of the things that I see quite often online in the forums, people will say, oh, speaker X, this amp doesn't have enough juice for it, or this is not a good match because the power output isn't enough. From your perspective, is there a specific thing that you listen for when the power output isn't enough? Or is it literally just a function of volume and clipping, as you mentioned earlier?
So you'll start to get, in the first instance, clipping. If it's clean, you can clip surprisingly up to a half of that peak off without it being too audible, especially in the mid-range and treble. But the other problem is, as the amplifier is trying to produce enough power, it's got more distortion itself, and then the interaction with the speakers. So yes, it's a problem. Like I say, you can't have everything. Part of my decision of sacrificing efficiency was to say, these days, amplifiers for a given power output level are a lot cheaper than they used to be, particularly with the introduction of Class D amplifiers. So high power is not as much of an issue as it used to be. Think of subwoofers in the old days. Before you were born, they were coffin size to go with a tube amplifier that was 10 or 20 watts. Nowadays, we put as big a driver as we can into a smaller cabinet as we can and get a 1,000-watt Class D amplifier to force the driver to overcome the kind of the resistance of the box in order to be able to move. The air in the cabinet is so stiff that you've got, like bicycle pump. It's like trying to pump a bicycle as you put more air in, and you kind of squeeze and squeeze, and that's what the big driver in a small box has to do. So you need a lot of force to make it do that. So when it comes to a low efficiency speaker, the amplifier you can run it into clipping a bit, but then you'll just the power supply will start collapsing because it doesn't have enough energy stored. And so now you get this low frequency modulation effects. So they're the things you're going to experience occasionally, right? And I think people often also equate the power with the position of where the volume control knob is. And obviously, if it's low sensitivity, another way of saying it is it's low gain. So you turn up the volume level knob, which is a gain control, to get back to that level. It doesn't necessarily tell you how much power output you're using, because maybe the recording was recorded at a very low average level in order not to clip the peaks. It's not a very compressed recording like most pop recordings. So that signal doesn't sound very loud, so you turn the gain up until it's loud enough into that speaker. Well, the corollary to that is if the speaker is lower gain, then you have to turn up the knob more. That doesn't tell you that you are actually putting more power in yet. But obviously, a low sensitivity speaker does need more power. And so I fully understand that our speakers need more power than average. But what annoys me, getting back to what I said earlier in the conversation about specifications, there are lots of speakers out there that are actually just as difficult a load, or perhaps more difficult a load, than any of the ELAC speakers. But we at least say it's a 4 ohm speaker because I follow the international standard of how you calculate what nominal impedance means. And there is no such thing in an international standard as 8 ohm compatible. It has no definition. It's a word that people are coming up with. Sometimes they'll say 8 ohm compatible, say 3.5 ohms minimum. Well, a speaker that's 3.5 minimum is a 4 ohm speaker. And it's not at that low impedance level across the whole frequency band. You really would be into trouble if it was. Always through the mid-band and the treble, the impedance is typically much higher than that. So there's just some range of frequencies in the mid-bass that will be most likely to draw that extra power. But my 4 ohm speaker is no worse than 4 or 5 other manufacturers with their 8 ohm compatible speaker. And then you look at sensitivity. Mine is low sensitivity, the spec. And you see that some people have a weird way of quoting sensitivity. It's either it gives 2 figures, and then when 90 and 93. How can it be both? Sensitivity of the speaker is how many dB do you get for how much voltage you put in? How can you have 2 numbers? Well, one's anechoic, one's measured in room. What room? Standards exist for a reason, so you can compare things, and you can't or shouldn't just invent your own new way of doing it. One company does it by, well, this is how we did it in 1940. Oh, great. Right. So, I think I have to talk about the competition to some degree, when I get asked questions.
Sure.
But what I'd like to see is someone to do these tests. How we always say, the one reason why we say sensitivity is good is if you go into a showroom and there's a wall of speakers and a switch box, and you can switch from one speaker to the other. The louder speaker will nearly always win that shoot-off. So from a marketing perspective, going to high sensitivity is good. But from an engineering perspective, it means I've sacrificed bass, like I said. But But it should, even though the average person couldn't measure what the true sensitivity or impedance is, it would be good if someone on a YouTube video just got a few pairs of these speakers and they said, okay, this one claims it's 6 dB louder. Let me just play it for you. And you set them side by side and put in the signal, even if it's noise. Start with noise. So it's an instant comparison rather than trying to remember how loud was that piece of music and then winding back to the beginning of it. Just put in noise, flick the switch. Is it really that much louder? Is it really that 6 dB louder? Or is it, it's a bit louder, right? And then you could also put a power meter on and say, how much extra power is it really drawing compared to this other one? That would be a fascinating experiment to do over YouTube, because it would show you that specs are not always what they're cracked up to be.
Yeah, I think that with little regulation, and if it becomes a point that will sell more speakers, that inevitably someone might take advantage of that. This could very well be one of those situations where it sells, it is a variable that people look at to buy a speaker. They like to look at specs and they see XYZ. It simplifies it for them. They can put it in a box in their mind where it validates the purchase and makes sure they don't feel bad about it afterwards based on the specs. So it's a comfort, right? If not a convincing factor. And then it would just be easy to change the number, because you're right. There's very little regulation on it, and maybe there should be more. But there is also a lot of research and conversation that goes on about how things pair and how things sound online that help kind of circumvent the spec wars on this. But you're absolutely right. I do think that it is a concern, and that you should always try to get stuff in and listen to it for yourself has always been my mantra, and not rely on the specs, paperwork, and measurements as much. They're tools to get to where you need, but you should focus on where you want to be and what you get when you get it in there. The other thing I wanted to just kind of add that I thought was really interesting that I've observed myself, as you said, that modern music has a lot more bass to it. And this is something that has subtly creeped into my mind just recently as well, because I've been listening to a lot of modern music on some full range speakers that I've got in the den. So I've been listening to modern music. And then we put on some old 70s stuff, and it is notoriously absent from the really low register where you were exactly like you were saying. I'm surprised.
Yeah, that rock music from the 70s, it's almost excruciating to listen to it because it's so thin and hard. Yeah. And where did all that bass go? Yeah.
It doesn't really thump, especially when you look at artists like Billie Eilish, who the whole album was made in her brother's bedroom, right? It's all electronic. There's very little real instrumentation in there outside of the vocals. They do these really low sweeps and booms and explosions and all that, and it's really different than anything you found in the 70s and even maybe the 80s, I would assume, where it's just like it's really cut off at a certain point. But you're right in that it adds to the music. And also, I pointed this out in other episodes, it adds something to the rest of the frequency spectrum that you don't necessarily, your brain, I think, just associates. It's just the low frequency, but it blends in and adds something to the rest. It affects the rest in the way you perceive it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, for those who are interested in subwoofers, because you bring that up, we just covered how to set up a subwoofer, and it literally is an hour-long podcast. So for those looking, Andrew, you're absolutely right. It's a complicated thing. You can get it right, but it is a lot of work, and you have to put the time in to get it right. So all the little knobs you need to twist, all the things you need to think about, that's in the previous episode. Now, bringing up an episode also from this season, we talked specifically about two-way and three-way designs. You have said that, I think, that your specific designs are done. I think you've alluded to a lot of this already, where you go to the three-way design specifically to help with the low range extension. And I'm assuming that this is because it pulls some of the effort away from the mid and the tweeter, allowing them to do their job better when the bass can focus on its jobs better. Do you think it's easier to make a good two-way, or a good three-way. The crossover network is ultimately way more complicated with the three-way. That just leaves it open for more error, I feel like. So I'm curious as why you chose to tackle that challenge, or do you think you could do a better two-way for the same price?
Well, I've always joked that when people say a good two-way will beat a three-way,
Right.
and I say that's only because you don't know how to design a good three-way.
Right.
It's very much more difficult. And the crossover, particularly, that was one of the challenges with the Unify. For $500, I've got to spend money on an extra drive unit and make it so you can put the tweeter down the middle of the mid-range driver. But now I have to build a three-way crossover. And I'm not scared of crossover networks. You know, as soon as I joined KEF and started working with product rather than research, I was working with computer-aided programs on the HP computer that we got to do crossover networks. And so I've had that experience built on it. And so complex networks don't frighten me. But I do know how they interact with the driver impedances and make it difficult to do. It's so easy to mess up, and the impedance drops down because the network itself is dropping the effective speaker impedance down below just the drive unit by itself, which sounds crazy, but you can see that happening in some designs. And it's those struggles to balance as you're calculating the crossover network shapes and the componentry needed for it that really take an awful lot of time. And pretty much the most expensive part of that Unify speaker was the crossover network. It's on a PC board that covers almost the entire bottom floor sort of the cabinet, and with 3 huge inductors, all laminated steel cores just for the base section. And it went on and on and on. And that's partly because I also wanted to cross over reasonably low. Originally it was 270 hertz. On some of the later designs that I've done, it's around 250 or 220, which is why I need such big inductors. If I'd have chosen to cross over at 500 hertz to the mid-range, the crossover would be a lot simpler, but then I'm not utilizing that mid-range unit over the whole range that I would like to, because it's a concentric. And if it's only good, yes, I've gained the advantage of it's concentric, but I'm crossing over at 500 hertz and then 2K to the tweeter. It's hardly doing anything. So, and one of the downsides of a good two-way, you can design some very, very good two-way systems, but you'll always be limited by the fact that the bass driver is carrying the mid-range music, the vocals. And you know, we talked about lots of low bass in modern recordings. You can absolutely hear vocal modulation, particularly on a vented speaker, when some of these low tones come in and you see the woofer cone just moving back and forth, and embedded on that moving back and forth is the vocal. And you'll just hear this modulated sound of the vocal. When you go to a three-way, and I did this experiment, you know, I knew this happens, but it's always useful to suddenly get exposed to it again once in a while. And I was doing this demonstration of some speakers that weren't my own. They were designed in Germany. But I got the job of playing them to an audience. And I put on a track from London Grammar. And there's the vocal and some simple instrumentation. But then this very low note comes in. And being a vented box, but also a design where they've chosen to put a very soft suspension on the driver, below the vent tuning frequency, the driver will just move a long way, not producing any real sound, but it'll move a long way. So it's trying to produce this low tone, which, yes, I can sort of hear it, I know it's doing it, but then the voices just went to pot. They sounded awful. Oh, wait, I can't use this, I can't play this piece of music. And when I got into the lab, I thought, okay, let me check all my speakers, see if they do the same. And they didn't to that extent, because I typically don't use such soft suspensions. I thought, well, what about the Unify? So I put on the Unify, and it's only a 5-inch bass driver, but it did a reasonable job of hearing some of that bass. But there was zero audibility of the vocal modulation because it wasn't coming from that driver. And it showed up to me clearly that, especially when you're trying to go to the extremes, that 3-way is going to handle stuff that the 2-way just can't do, certainly in a compact speaker, a bookshelf type speaker. But the cost of doing that 3-way is, you've got to carefully evaluate, is it worth the cost? What other things could I have done in a 2-way? It's just like I'm saying with the argument of efficiency versus bass. If I have efficiency, I'm giving up bass. If I have a 3-way, I'm gaining no vocal modulation, but it's costing, just because of that, it's costing me a lot. Extra driving, it's extra crossover components. So the 2-way, as long as you're not playing music that had that very low frequency tone in it, couldn't I spend all that money on just a much better comb material, a much better dome, and a bigger magnet on the tweeter, and neodymium, and stiffer box, and all these kind of things? So that's what you face every time you start to design a speaker. What are the choices you're going to make? It's like a chef, how he's building a dish. That comes down to a personal decision for me. How do I decide between those two things? But because I like concentric drivers and I feel I have to do them as a 3-way, the modulation with that, putting into a 5-inch concentric driver, you'd have way more modulation effects. So 3-way, for me, and thinking about modern music, I think whenever I can, I'll put some of that money into it being a 3-way.
That is absolutely such a crazy point that I hadn't thought about. If it's just a formula, let's just say it's just a formula, and you have A, B, and C. So we have driver 1, driver 2. Is the addition of the expensive crossover network plus the cost of the third driver, can that money be reallocated to better materials on the other 2 drivers to thus elevate this? And it is like a balancing act between those ultimately four variables, but 2 are tied to each other, correct? Yeah. I had never thought of it from such a formulaic way, but that's a remarkable way to put it. I mean, how would you say that changes then when you start to scale up? Because you're talking about locking it in at 500. It's such a very restricting price point. Would you say then that ultimately does that shift as you go to $1,000 and $2,000, and then obviously you can do whatever you want when it's way up there, but as you go up that sliding scale, do you think that either 2-way or 3-ways become easier or cheaper to design?
Well, this part of it there's a fundamental limitation in that 2-way, that you will carry the vocal on the bass driver cone. Now you can, as you go up in price point, I can put a much more linear motor structure on it. So
on the 2 or the 3-way?
On the 2-way, let's say. Let's see, I'm not going to do a 3-way, I'm going to put engineering into the drivers, and can I make it perform better on that torture test of low synthesizer tone and vocal? And of course, I can do more because the driver let's say the bass driver in a $500 system, it pretty much, you've got a ferrite magnet, a top plate, a back plate, and a coil. And you choose the thickness of the top plate, you choose the size of the ceramic, and or ferrite, and you choose to wind the voice coil of a certain length. And the difference between coil length and magnet top plate thickness is sort of how far it can move linearly. So the more linear I can make that process, the better. So I could go for underhung, short coil in a long gap. It's a much more linear force applied to the coil than you typically get the other way around in overhung. Or I could go for a technology that splits the top plate into two pieces and puts extra magnets in. So I can do all these things to say when it is moving that far, it's going to be perfectly linear. So therefore the vocal modulation will be less. There'll still be Doppler, just like when trains approaching you and going far away, you get that Doppler shift of the tone. You get Doppler distortion on a driver. The research is split on whether just how audible Doppler distortion is. Typically, intermodulation distortion is more audible than Doppler. So if the force isn't linear over the whole movement, you'll get both intermodulation distortion and Doppler distortion. Is it sufficient to just remove that intermodulation distortion by having a very linear force? Because Doppler isn't that audible, or is Doppler that audible? But no doubt removing that intermodulation distortion is a good thing. So you'd put money into that. So now maybe you've reduced the vocal modulation. So you spent money on that motor structure, vocal modulation has been reduced. But there's still a limit there because the driver is carrying both signals. If you went to a three-way, you can eliminate totally that modulation because the vocal is carried on a different driver. This is what any engineering. Engineering is you're working with compromises. Theoretical research, it's not, but with practical engineering, you can never make something perfect. And so you're left with choosing where those imperfections lie. So for that two-way system, I've been able to spend more money on the magnet. The three-way system, I don't maybe need quite as linear a motor to begin with because it's carrying a narrower band, it's not carrying vocal. So yeah, the bass is a bit distorted, but bass distortion sounds very different from mid-range distortion. And it almost acts like a compressor. And we all know in recording, you compress some of those drum sounds to fatten up the sound of the drums. So once you've done it as a three-way system, up to a limit, that distortion isn't as audible. So the speaker can play louder. I can't put quite as an exotic cone material in because I spent it on the crossover and the extra driver. But can I still get a really good sound? Yes, I can. And that's every day, that's what the job is, working out which compromises you're going to choose for that price range that you're aiming for.
So the ELAC line has been expanding in many directions since the debut in the Unify lines that we've been discussing. Do you think there is still more room to grow those lines, or do you feel like you've hit a point where we're looking at refinement?
Okay, debut one, okay, that was our first speaker for the brand. It's, let's say, 3 years on. Do we make a change to it? If we caught people out, the manufacturers, by having such good sound at that price point, everyone's going to come and then try and the hi-fi market isn't really a growing market, and certain parts of it are a shrinking market, except for this year. So we grew our market by taking away market share from someone else. They're going to try and get it back. So whereas normally you think of speakers as a relatively mature product, and you would change them every 5-6 years maybe, we decided, no, I think we need to do it sooner. So that's why we did Debut 2.0. The problem is, if Debut 1, let's call it Debut 1, was so successful and it had a sound to it, if I supposedly make Debut 2 better, is it better to everybody? Maybe they actually like the sound of the old one because they just like the sound of that. Or should I change it to how I recognize the limitations of what I did in that original one and make improvements I feel I want to hear, and then say, yes, it's different and it's better, not just different. But that's always something when you're designing that you kind of have to be aware of. What constitutes better? Maybe it just matched the equipment that you're likely to purchase at that price point really well, and it just all gelled and gave that nice combinational sound. And if you change any part of that, it no longer has that magic.
I think what you're alluding to is you could change some things, but you're a little bit concerned it might not sound as good to some people.
Right. But there's a danger there because I've always gone, like I said, by the sound I want to hear from recordings. If I start questioning that, you end up chasing your tail, because you only have to read forums about reviews or what. If someone says, oh, I'm in the market to buy something, and can anyone out there give me some recommendations? And you'll get a list from a lot of people you've never heard from before. And then you'll get others fighting. You can't really recommend that speaker. That one's awful. I listened to that one. That's terrible. Or some people will say, even with my speakers, with the Debut, I've had comments from, well, is this right? Because it sounds a bit dull to me. And, well, what were we listening to before? And it was a bright speaker. And so, well, of course it's going to sound dull compared to that. But then you get other people going, yeah, your speaker's a bit bright. I go, it can't be both bright and dull. And if it is to those different people, what were the references that allow them to say it's dull or it's bright? I don't know what that was. I don't know what your room is. You might have a bright room.
You might have some hearing loss up top.
Yeah, so you can't live your life by reading comments in that way. You have to have faith in yourself to say, no, if I think this is better, and I've had enough of a following of people liking my speakers, then odds are that they'll also like this new one. But it's just so easy to get into a mode of second guessing yourself and being worried. So I had that going to Debut 2. Then we decided to do Debut Reference. And it's sort of the same formula, but everything's got to be better yet again, right? So it can get pretty worrisome sometimes during development. That are we doing the right thing here? Am I doing the right thing? So we've done 2 upgrades to Debut. We've done 1 upgrade to Unify, and I'll leave it at that. Hint, hint.
Yeah. Ooh, getting the scoop here, people.
Yeah,
we're getting the scoop.
Don't spend too much money yet. Save some of it. And
Well, because I am actually, Andrew, I am the owner of the original Unify 5, UB5. So I
Right.
do have a pair here at the house that I bought. So I thought they were great. But I mean, I'll be honest. When we did talk about this, they are not as efficient as some of the other stuff on the market. From my experience, it took a little more juice to get them to the same level compared to a lot of things. But the sound was rewarding, and you're absolutely right about the way that you do the bass. We had a group listening test with a couple of amplifiers with some friends, and they were pretty much blown away by the bass response from the size. It was unexpected. And so you do have, I think, when you deal with bass and at these sizes and these amplifiers, and more importantly, these spending levels, it does become a little bit tricky with the power handling and making sure you're getting everything you can get out of these things. So I feel like they're absolutely great performers for the price, but you just have to think about what you're doing a little bit more than just simply amp, speaker, let's go. You can do that, but
Absolutely.
if you're like thinking about optimizing the thing, they add some more like variability than just like a full range drop a thing on it and whatever. I will say, under some circumstances, and this is a little bit strange, that the harder they are to drive, the less responsive they are to intricacies within the amplifier. Sometimes if something is like really easily driven, all of a sudden, if the amp is a little bit weird or does a kind of a weird thing, it will show that a lot more. So in a way, I found them to be a little trickier, but more forgiving of unusual behavior in amplifiers. Just my 2 cents. But so there's the Carina, the Novice, the Vela lines. They all kind of bounce between ELAC's concentric driver unit and a JET folded ribbon tweeter. What is your opinion on hard dome tweeners? And I ask that because they seem to be, and correct me if I'm wrong here, notoriously absent from all your designs. I don't see any aluminum there. I don't really see any.
That's correct. Yeah. So first, let's talk about concentric versus jet tweeter. The jet tweeters, all the way up to the Jet 6, were all manufactured in-house in Germany. So
okay,
they're very
so
expensive.
Those aren't your design, is what you're saying?
They're not my design.
Oh, okay.
And so I couldn't, even if I wanted to use it, I couldn't. Yeah, we talk about the cost hit of going to a three-way and the three-way concentric. These are all affordable speakers, and those drivers would have taken away so much of my ability to put engineering into the other parts at the price ranges I was looking at, that it wasn't a worthwhile compromise to look at. It's nothing about what I feel about the sound of folded ribbons. It's just with our folded ribbons, it wasn't possible. But I've done the Carina, which has a folded ribbon, and it's at a price point higher than, and it's a two-way. It gets back to this question. Well, it's a two-way, and it costs more than your three-way with a concentric. So what's going on there? And the Carina, partly, it's because ELAC has been known since the 80s for the jet tweeter. It's become a signature part of them. It means that when they came to revamping some of their ranges, then we thought, well, why don't I do one of those ranges and Germany does the other one? So the Vela is all designed by our German guys, and the Carina was by me. And it was my first time playing around with a folded ribbon tweeter in earnest. I've had them to evaluate in the past, but always rejected them because if I was spending that much extra money, I'd want to at least have a concentric driver. And it's very difficult to integrate a jet tweeter into a concentric driver. We have got some within Germany's range of speakers, but not only are you now paying for the cost of that jet tweeter and the costs associated with trying to shrink it down a little. But now your voice coil has to be at least a 3-inch diameter voice coil. And if you were intended to doing a 5-inch mid-range, but 3 inches of it were cut out the middle to accommodate the tweeter, you've not got much cone left, so you drastically reduce your cone area. So I'd always avoided it. But since this was an update to an existing series, which was a jet-based two-way speaker, then what I was doing is, how best do I engineer that two-way jet speaker to give an update and to, let's say, put my flavor on it. So that's what started that all, and got me looking at, well, what does a jet tweeter do differently? It has very different high-end dispersion characteristics. It has an extended high end. In the old days, jet tweeters always went out higher than dome tweeters, but now there are plenty of soft dome tweeters on the market that go out to 40K, higher than most actual metal domes, unless you're using something like beryllium. So it's interesting. You just think, well, a metal dome is going to be what you need to get out to the highest frequencies, but it's not. The dome tweeters are getting at least as high. So, but a dome tweeter in that high frequency range is more directional than the folded ribbons that I've used. And that has an impact on what you're going to make as your choices for balancing the speaker. You know, if we say with one speaker we went for a flat balance on axis, but if the tweeters have got different dispersion at their top end, one of them, although flat on axis, is going to sound brighter than the other if you're in a live room. They'll sound identical in a dead room, but they'll sound different in a live room. And you've got to be aware of, how do you deal with that? How do you balance between, should I tame down the top end a bit on axis because I've got all this extra high frequency energy coming back at me, which a dome tweeter didn't have? Or do I leave it alone? And that's just part and parcel of what contributes to the sound of a folded ribbon. The other factor is it won't go down as low as most dome tweeters. So I'm more restricted in my choice of crossover frequency. I don't want to put it up too much, because then you've got more problems between when you move vertically up and down, you know, you've got more phase differences and screws up the crossover region. So I like to cross over as low as I can, but I can't. It was saying to me, you can have 2.8 kilohertz, and that's the best you're going to get out of me. That was the conversation in my mind. So now I've got to make sure that the bass driver goes up higher in frequency than I would traditionally cross it over at, and doesn't get into trouble with its cone resonances. So it was a fun process of learning how best to use a folded ribbon tweeter.
Okay. So I just have two more quick questions for you. This next one is just an A, B, or C, but you can add a D if you like, okay? So what's the easiest thing to screw up? The cabinet, the crossover, or the driver design?
Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult choice. Let me say crossover first. Because even with the best drivers, if you don't integrate them properly, your speaker sounds like a collection of drivers. There are a lot of, even low-cost drivers integrated well together can sound good. You know, the other compromise I've always said about the debut was, I said drivers first, then crossover, then box. And I hear all the time what the box is doing, but most boxes do something, and I think you tend to tune that out. But Like I say, no matter how good the drivers are, they can't make music unless they're blended together in the right way. You just hear a boom tiz, and I try and design the best drivers I can within that price point, and I spend as much money as I can, but knowing that I got to blend them together in the crossover properly.
In a very general sense, what is your best tip for just listening to audio?
Close the drapes, turn out the lights, don't do anything else. Just get absorbed into it. We don't do that as much these days. There's always distractions. I even think one of the reasons people think that vinyl is superior to digital is that vinyl demands a degree of concentration to get into listening to the music. Find it first. You can't search on your computer for that track. You've got to search your shelves. Then you've got to take it out. Then you've got to put it on. Then you've got to clean it. Then you've got to lower the stylus. And then you've got to play all the tracks. You can't shuffle. So that puts you in a mindset. If you're going to go through all that, you set aside some time to listen and then remove all of the distractions. And you can get so much more into the music that way that sometimes, when we discuss about how well speakers image, if you're in the right frame of mind, I've had this happen so often where I'll start putting something on, and a few minutes into that, you become so relaxed that the sound just suddenly starts to and just open up around you and spread around you, and you move into that recording rather than it being something presented that's out in front of you. And that's without using alcohol or drugs to help, right? But you can't do that if you're distracted. So it's that it's such a different experience when you turn out the lights to listen to that music. So that would be it.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about the correlation between the amount of focus it takes to execute the medium as to also how it impacts your enjoyment of the sound. That's brilliant. I love it. Andrew Jones, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. It was fun. Thanks, guys.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and AudioHead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.